Hi! A while back I asked you guys about questions for me and I got loads of great questions and today I will do my best to answer them and they will range from everything to my favorite dessert to some sewing tips and tricks and even something about my skincare routine. So let's go! And if you're new to this channel, please hit subscribe and also check out my blog thelaststitch.com where you will learn loads more about me and also find some of the tutorials and tips and tricks that I will talk about in this video. But now let's go to the questions. Question number 1. Mia Celestine asked, what sort of sewing schedule do I have? Do I sew only on Sundays or am I also able to fit it in during the weekdays? Well, for the most of my sewing is made during the weekends and there are several reasons for that, but the main is that I work full time, so my weekdays are pretty much dedicated to that and just cooking, fixing stuff, all that sort of thing that comes into the day-to-day life. And also I think rest is quite important and I also try to fit in exercise on most weekdays, so there's not much time left for me to actually hit the sewing machine. And then there's another reason why I don't sew much during the weekdays, and that is because I am often quite tired and stressed. I've noticed that I make more sewing errors when I sort of try to squeeze in a little bit of sewing. I need to be fully focused and engaged, and that is much easier in the weekends when I'm rested. I do sometimes do some sewing, and I mean some sewing isn't that difficult. I mean I can cut perhaps fabric, trace patterns if I feel I have more energy, and if I already started on something simple I can usually do a little bit of that too in the weekdays, but most yes on sewing on Saturday and Sundays. And now a question from Faye Thompson. I made the Sew Liberated matcha top in Liberty Lawn, but I got a slightly warped hem on the blouse despite pressing carefully and using wonder clips, and she wonders if I have any suggestions on how to avoid this issue. Well, warped hem is quite common and I wasn't familiar with this pattern, so I googled it, and I would say that I saw that quite a few of the finished versions actually has slightly warped hem, so it could be a pattern construction issue, and it usually depends on how the hem is shaped. The hem on this top isn't actually round, which is one of the causes that you get warped hem, but there could be perhaps the fact that it's quite wide and it's easy to stretch out the fabric when you're sewing. And that said, there are actually several ways that you can do to avoid this, and luckily I just finished a Liberty Lawn blouse myself, so it's quite simple. It has a straight hem just like the top the Faye is talking about, and I do have some tips and tricks on how to make that, so I will just show you how I do it. As you can see, it's a narrow hem, and that is the first thing that you need to look into, because a narrow hem, which usually means less warped. And secondly, the method that I always use when I make a narrow hem is that I sew a stitch 1 centimeter in from the edge, and I use that stitch as a guide. So I fold it at the stitch, press, then I fold the fabric a second time and then press. And this will create a very flat seam, which obviously is important that you have. And secondly, you need to learn how to manipulate the fabric. I don't know if that's the right word, but as we all know, fabrics are very living creatures basically. So depending on the fabric, some are easy to work with, some are harder, and you might have to do certain manipulating while you're sewing to make sure that the hem won't get warped. And one trick that I have when I work with difficult fabrics, I use this is an awl, and I feed the upper layer of the fabric while I'm sewing. So I just feed it like that, and that will make sure that the outer layer won't stretch out. So if you're working with difficult fabrics, you might have to employ this method. I didn't actually have to do that on the Liberty Lawn, but I do think that because I have been sewing for such a long time, I've sort of learned the hard way to how the fabric should feel when I'm feeding it. So I think I subconsciously do little things with my fingers just to make sure that it won't get stretched out. So that's basically what comes with practice. And I understand, because a warped hem is not very fun, and to be honest, on some fabrics it's almost impossible to avoid. You can also see that when you're buying ready-to-wear garments. in some sort of fabrics they usually have slightly warped hem, so it's hard to avoid completely. Catherine Meadows asks, have you ever done an all-in facing on a sleeveless top? I tried the threads method in the video. It didn't work out for me because the shoulder was too narrow, and she wonders if I have done one sleeveless all-in-one facing and if I have any techniques to share. Well, I do. I've done lots of all-in facings on sleeveless tops and dresses over the years. The method that I prefer to use is that, this will be difficult to understand if I can't show you, but the method is quite common in sewing books. You will find it in the Reader's Digest sewing book and in several other ones. And basically what you do, I will show here on a dress that I've done. This actually isn't facing, it's lining, but I use the same principle. So what you do is that you place the facing, and first a couple of words about the facing. If you're doing an all-in facing, it can get quite flimsy, so you have to sort of figure out the right sizing for your project. And what I do is that I place the facing right side facing the garment, and I sew from the wrong side, and then I sew all the seams starting at where the seam allowance ends, because that's super important. You can't sew all the way, you have to start where the seam allowance begins, and you sew all the way around here, and of course the neckline you sew there, leaving the amount that you have for seam allowance. And with this method, for me at least, it helps to have a slightly wider seam allowance, because you need to have some extra fabric. And on the outside, then you have attached it all the way until the seam, the shoulder seam, and you haven't closed the shoulder seam. And on the outer part of the fabric, you will use sewing machine to close the shoulder seam. And you do that. There are tricks to make this easier in the Reader's Digest book that I talked about. There will be a link to that book in the description section. They suggest doing a tack in the fabric to make it easier, and Berta suggests using a wooden spoon. I haven't tried that method, so I can't vouch for it, but I'm probably, if I will understand it one day, I think it's a pretty good method, I'm sure, because they have used that for decades, the wooden spoon method, so I assume it works. Anyways, you sew together the upper layer or the outer layer with the sewing machine, so now you have a closed seam there, but then you haven't closed the facing or the lining. And this is where I actually do hand stitching or slip stitching. You can sometimes successfully manage to sew the seam squeezing, but it's really, really difficult. And I find that I have much more control if I employ hand sewing for the inside. And as you can see here on the dress that I'm having here, on the outside, the black lace fabric, it looks, just like a regular seam. And on the inside, you can see the tiny stitches here. Well, I can't say that this is the best method, but this is the method that I prefer, and it's very easy to control. And as your original question was, I need something that works on narrow shoulders, and as you can see, this one is quite narrow. I'm not sure if your project was even more narrow, but I think that this method will work on pretty much all width of the shoulder seam. So hopefully you found this understandable, but I highly recommend that you check out the method. I know it's very common, at least in older sewing books, and as I said, I recommend getting the Reader's Digest sewing book. I don't remember the exact title, but it will be in the description box, because it's a great basic book. But I do have another suggestion as well, and the disadvantage with using all-in facings or facings in general is that they can be very floppy. They can sort of turn up, and I mean, they're not very nice. It doesn't always look professional. So I have lately begun experimenting with another method where I use a very narrow facing, and I've employed that on this dress. And so I don't use all-in-one facing. Instead, I use narrow facing. So it's just a tiny strip here, and I've explained this method in detail in a blog post, so there will be again links in the description section where you can see how this method works. Now, of course, this means you have to do a separate facing for the sleeveless part, but I think that if you don't like floppy facings, I would definitely recommend considering this method as well, because it's another option, and well, I think it could be even easier than doing the other method that we talked about earlier. Anna-Marie wants to know, I wonder about your skincare routine. You have such a clear and wrinkle-free skin. Oh, well, thank you. To be honest, I do put a lot of effort into lightening when I make my videos, so I do think that they sort of ease out some of the wrinkles that I actually have, to be honest. But I do have quite a specific skincare routine, and I've been meticulous about using products like retinol, glycolic acid, and also, let me see if I can tell, hyaluronic acid, I think it's also called in English. All these things actually do have proven effects. Not a miracle worker, but well, they do help smoothing out the face. And I also have problems with clogged pores, so I use them for these purposes as well. Also, another thing is that when I was 16 years old, I decided that I've had it with sunbathing and that pale skin was way cooler. So I've been very careful about exposing myself in the sun since then, which I do think perhaps have made my skin age a little bit less. Also, I do live in Sweden, which also means that, well, there's not much sun for the most part of the year, so that probably helps with wrinkle prevention as well. But thank you anyways, and I have some products that I use, and I will link to them all in the description section, so you can check that out if you want to know the specific products I'm currently using. That might change over time, but this is the method I'm using right now. Another sewing question. Adrian asks me, do you make a full seat adjustment to button patterns, and if you do, how do you do it? I've tried several ways, but I'm not quite satisfied with the results. Yes. I don't know if my body is special, but I have to do both a full seat adjustment and a flat butt adjustment, because I think the thing for my particular butt is that it's quite full at the top and then it sort of drops down at the bottom. As for the full butt adjustment, what I do two things. I work with the crotch, and I lengthen the crotch seam. I make it longer, and I also make the crotch deeper. So it's not just about making the seam longer, it's also making the crotch deeper, which means that I create a longer crotch seam all in all. And I need to do both these things. I mean, both heighten the mid-back seam and scoop out the crotch on most patterns. And I find this absolutely super important for me, because if I sit down, the trouser will ride down a long way. And I also do these alterations when I'm making my own workout leggings. I have to do both these things, scoop out the crotch and lengthen it. So yes, I do that. That is the method that I like. I know there are several more methods that you can do this, but this I found works well for me. Pencil Girls also want to know what my favorite Swedish dessert is, and well, I love desserts to start with. I could eat one every day, and there are lots of wonderful Swedish desserts, but the one I sort of think that is my favorite is the berry crumble pie. In Sweden, we don't usually put crust on our berries and fruit pies. Instead, we just do crumble on top, and that combination with the crumble, with the Swedish pies aren't that sweet, they're quite sour, so you can really feel, if you're doing some blueberries and stuff, you can still feel the tartness of the fruit and the berries. And then we eat it with either ice cream, vanilla ice cream, or vanilla custard, and both these are wonderful, and I could probably eat that one every day. So yes, I would say that this is my favorite Swedish dessert. It's called smulpie in Swedish, but it's basically just a regular berry crumble. So that was all the questions I had time for. Wasn't able to answer all your questions, but I will definitely do another video in the future. And so if you have more questions for me, just tell me in the comment section. I would love to know, and then I'll make a second Q&A video at a later date. Thank you so much for watching, and well, I'll see you next time. Bye bye!